Hey guys, welcome back to part 3. In part 2 and part 1, we had a look at the very early stages of redoing a piece and analyzing why it wasn't working. In this part of the tutorial, I want to explain that the next phase I typically move into is thumbnails. And the first series of thumbnails I tend to do are really quick sketches in black and white, first of the original, and then usually of some quick ideas after that, to have a look at what is working and not working in the original in terms of the shape read, and what could possibly the final image end up looking like in terms of balance of light and dark. In this top right image, we have a little bit of a balance between light and dark, where it's sort of leaning maybe a bit more towards maybe the white or the black. We're not quite sure. It's almost a 50-50 here, which isn't always good. I do recommend pushing one or the other a little bit further. In the bottom left image, clearly the light is dominant, and in the bottom right, clearly the architecture is dominant. In all of these images, I kind of felt that what I kept trying to explore and trying to push was this idea that the ceiling could be open or provide more light. And when you just have black and white, this effect can be quite extreme and it can overlight your scene in a way that isn't very pleasing when we're trying to create the image we are trying to create. So it's totally fine at this stage to be still playing around, and I still treat thumbnails as a playing around process and phase. And a lot of people these days, I've noticed, tend to use thumbnails as an almost final stage of thinking out a piece and a composition. And I think that's totally fine if that's your skill set. For me personally, I've never really worked that way, and I've always worked in a broad to fine process. And so I'm still very much thinking at this stage. So moving forward, I like to work into a few more values into an image. And I start asking myself, is the space open? Do I put angular architecture? Do I have smaller characters, which are easier to render? Do I have it to be a bit more of an open scene? Do I want an entrance and an exit? How much of the storytelling do I want to tell the audience? And how much can they tell from the image? So at this stage, I'm playing around with framing, I'm playing around with values, depth, scale, lots of exploration still happening at this stage for me. I'm still mentally trying to track what is working for the scene and what isn't. And one of the greatest reasons it's important to explore, especially on this piece, is because the design brief is pretty, let's say, not typical. I think doing a fantasy piece or doing a realistic piece, you're bound by something that we kind of already know. It's a village, it's a house, it looks a certain way. It's made of wood, we know it's metal, or we know it's a building, a mansion from the 1920s. So we can say with some certainty and some research that that's what those things look like. I do find that science fiction allows for more creativity, but at the same time, there's a cost to that, which is it opens you up to an infinite amount of possibilities in terms of shape language, in terms of how do you deliver the feeling of science fiction, of the lighting, the way architecture is shaped, of the furniture, so many elements, and I think that's why still exploring, for me personally, is a very important thing to do at this phase where I'm playing with bigger shapes and wider shapes and strange architecture and just not thinking too much about the detail of how things look, but rather how they sit in the composition. So at this stage, I'm thinking of like, this has to be a big shape back here. I'm not concerned with what exactly it is. It's an abstract to me right now still. I know I want light to come into my scene. I know I want some kind of desk and table to be present that is a clearance point. I know I want maybe some characters in the scene. I know I want some furniture in the scene, like down here. Um, then little ideas pop into my head, like maybe there's a transparent walkway up here, like in the airport in my hometown, where you can see the arrivals passing through on, walking or being carried by an escalator or something. Maybe the front desk is quite simple. Maybe it's in the foreground. Maybe the foreground isn't as lit as the background because the background is our focus. How do we do that whilst still having secondary importance and then primary importance to an image? What happens if I put light right in the foreground and we don't see the window, or maybe we see a repetition of it here and we kind of our mind starts to know that there's a window back here because we're telling it here, and maybe we're telling it down there. So at this stage of creating an image, I'm still mentally preparing for how I'm going to move into 3D and what I'm going to be making there. When I move into 3D, I can move the camera as I please. I can have it slightly lower than a horizon, like in this image here, which is maybe like a puppy cam, or maybe I have it more at eye level, like in this top left image or the bottom right image. Maybe it's a little off to the side. I'm also still thinking like there's a lot of angles in these images. Maybe my final camera placement won't have those angles, and maybe it will set the scene up for either a more peaceful and tranquil horizontal image like this bottom right one, and maybe that's going to have some kind of psychological effect on the viewer. I'm also thinking about like what might the lighting be in here like? Is it going to be brighter than the other parts of the image in terms of may the color be different? So there's a lot of thinking that's happening whilst I'm banging these thumbnails out, and for me at least, I like to still keep it loose and keep that ideation process going and keep the inspiration and the morale high for moving forward. And it allows me to feel a bit more playful with the way I create my images and my architecture and the layout. And it also allows me to play around with being the film director. I'm the camera guy. I get to move into my 3D scene next and set some things up. So the next phase is typically looking at these images and extracting assets out of them into what might go into these scenes. So I know I want some chairs, I know I need a window, I know I need some pillars and some basic ceiling, I know I need a desk, I know I might need some characters, I know I might need maybe a shelf, maybe another room, maybe some countertop stuff. Um, Whatever it might be, at this stage I can already start to pencil in on paper what is it that I exactly need for this scene, and I can start moving towards a final concept. And when I work in 3D, I can grab the concept of a diagonal pillar and I can start to flesh that out and start to model it quite abstractly still, quite block meshy. And during the process of doing that, I can throw textures on, which you'll see in the next phase, and we can start laying in the textures and lighting to create something that is a really strong starting point for our painting. So I hope you guys found this interesting, and I hope it's useful, and I hope that this opens you up to a different way of working. I'll see you in part 4.